The red sun of Tharsis IV hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. Jagged rock formations pierced the sky like ancient spears, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of relentless dust storms. In this desolate corner of a forgotten planet, Mark Reeves trudged forward, each step a deliberate act of defiance against the hostile environment that seemed determined to claim him. His boots crunched against the gravel, kicking up puffs of rust-colored dust that danced briefly in the dying light before settling back to the surface. Blood trickled down his arm from a deep gash, leaving a trail of dark droplets on the soil beneath his boots. The wound pulsed with each heartbeat, a constant reminder of his narrow escape from the corporate security forces now hunting him across this unforgiving terrain. The plasma burn had seared through his environmental suit, exposing the flesh beneath to Tharsis IV's abrasive atmosphere. Each breath drawn through his damaged respirator sent needles of pain through his chest, the planet's thin air providing barely enough oxygen to sustain consciousness. He couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. The small bundle cradled against his chest emitted a soft whimper, the sound barely audible above the persistent wind that scoured the planet's surface. Mark adjusted his grip, careful not to disturb the blue-furred creature nestled within the folds of his tattered jacket. The alien cub had finally stopped trembling, though its oversized eyes remained fixed on Mark's face with an intensity that unsettled him. Those eyes held intelligence far beyond what he would expect from a creature so young, regardless of species. Deep indigo irises, surrounded by opalescent sclera, tracked his every movement, blinking occasionally against the blowing dust. "Just a little farther," he whispered, more to himself than to the alien cub. His voice sounded rough, damaged by days of breathing the planet's dust-laden atmosphere without proper filtration. The words rasped in his throat, emerging as little more than a hoarse murmur. "We'll find shelter before nightfall." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Mark had been making similar promises for 3 days now, pushing his body beyond its limits while the Terra Nova Corporation deployed every resource at their disposal to hunt down their rogue surveyor. Each time he closed his eyes, the massacre replayed in vivid detail. The screams, the bodies falling, the cold efficiency with which his former employers had eliminated an entire settlement of sentient beings. The memory of blue blood darkening the soil haunted his fitful sleep, mingling with the faces of those he had failed to save. 3 days earlier, Mark had been just another surveyor for Terra Nova Corporation, mapping potential mining sites across the planet's northern hemisphere. His career spanned 15 years across a dozen frontier worlds, each assignment following the same pattern. Identify resource-rich areas, mark them for extraction teams, and move on. No questions asked about what or who might already call those places home. His existence had been predictable, comfortable in its routine isolation. Wake at dawn, calibrate equipment, plot survey routes, collect samples, file reports, sleep. Repeat until the quadrant was completely assessed, then transfer to the next assignment. The corporation valued his thoroughness and discretion, qualities that had earned him progressively greater autonomy in field operations. Mark had never considered himself particularly moral or courageous. Growing up in the crowded underground warrens of Mars Colony 7 had taught him the value of keeping his head down, doing his job, and avoiding complications. The colony's strict resource allocation meant that disruptive individuals found their air and water rations mysteriously reduced. After his parents died in a pressure seal failure when he was 16, he had few options beyond corporate service. Terra Nova had paid for his technical education in exchange for a 10-year contract. When those 10 years ended, he simply renewed rather than face the uncertainty of civilian life. The work suited his solitary nature, sending him to distant worlds where human interaction was limited to occasional communications with headquarters and infrequent meetups with other survey teams. Life as a frontier surveyor had hardened him physically. Years of working in variable gravity environments had given him wiry strength, while exposure to different atmospheric conditions had adapted his lungs to function efficiently across a range of pressures and compositions. His skin, weathered by the light of a dozen different suns, had the leathery texture common to those who spent their lives on the frontier. But the lifestyle had also isolated him emotionally. Mark hadn't maintained a meaningful relationship in years. His infrequent leaves on company stations, typically spent alone, reading or upgrading his equipment rather than seeking companionship. Then came the valley on Tharsis 4, and everything changed. The ship's sensors had picked up unusual mineral readings from a deep canyon, prompting Mark to investigate on foot. Standard procedure would have been to deploy drones, but atmospheric interference on Tharsis 4 rendered most remote surveillance equipment unreliable. Magnetic anomalies disrupted navigation systems, while the planet's frequent dust storms abraded delicate components within hours. Personal inspection was often necessary, though rarely pleasant. Mark had expected to find another deposit of the rare metamorphic crystals that made this otherwise inhospitable planet valuable to Terra Nova. The crystals, formed under the unique pressure and temperature conditions near the planet's equatorial belt, contain properties that revolutionize quantum computing when properly processed. A single rich vein could justify the substantial expense of establishing a mining operation. But what he discovered changed everything. Hidden among the rocks was a small community of indigenous creatures, tall, lean beings with luminescent blue skin that seemed to shimmer in the shadows of their cave dwellings. Their civilization was primitive by human standards, but their eyes held an unmistakable intelligence that Mark recognized immediately. Mark had encountered alien species before. Most frontier planets harbored some form of complex life, but never a sentient civilization untouched by human influence. Terra Nova's briefing materials for Tharsis 4 had explicitly classified the planet as uninhabited by sentient species. The existence of these beings directly contradicted official records, raising uncomfortable questions. Had the corporations simply failed to detect them during preliminary surveys? Or had Terra Nova deliberately concealed their existence to avoid the regulatory complications that came with establishing operations on inhabited worlds? He should have reported the discovery immediately. Corporate protocol was clear regarding first contact scenarios. Section 7.3 of the Surveyor's Manual required immediate notification of headquarters, followed by withdrawal from the area pending arrival of a specialized assessment team. Violating this protocol carried severe penalties, including contract termination and potential criminal charges. But something in the way these creatures moved, a grace that spoke of deep connection to their harsh environment, made him hesitate. He knew how Terra Nova typically handled complications to their extraction plans. Mark had watched from a distance, fascinated by the complexity of their society. The blue beings moved with deliberate purpose, communicating through a complex system of clicks and low rumbles supplemented by subtle body movements. They hunted with stone-tipped spears and processed their food using tools fashioned from bone and rock. Children played among the adults, their movements quick and nimble as they chased each other through the settlement. One small cub in particular caught Mark's attention, smaller than the others with fur of a deeper, more vibrant blue. Unlike its peers who raced about with boundless energy, this cub often sat apart, watching the stars with what appeared to be contemplation. For 3 days, Mark observed them, making detailed notes that never mentioned their existence. Each night, he deleted his findings from the official log and replaced them with falsified geological data. "Nothing of value here," he reported back to the company. "Moving on to Sector 7 tomorrow." The deception required careful attention to detail. Mark provided genuine soil samples from a different location, ensuring that his reports would withstand cursory scrutiny. He manipulated his equipment to generate plausible but discouraging readings for the valley. He even staged a minor equipment malfunction to explain his extended stay in the area without significant findings. The deception should have troubled him more than it did. 15 years of loyal service to Terra Nova, thrown aside for creatures he had never met and couldn't communicate with. Yet each time he composed his false reports, Mark felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, as though some part of him had been waiting for precisely this opportunity to break from the corporation that had defined his adult life. Perhaps it was the simple joy of watching these beings exist in harmony with their environment, a stark contrast to the exploitative approach human corporations took toward frontier worlds. Or perhaps it was the recognition of something within himself that had been suppressed for too long, a capacity for empathy and moral action that his life as a corporate surveyor had never engaged. On the fourth day, they came without warning. Mark woke to the distant hum of dropships. 5 of them, bearing Terra Nova's insignia, descended upon the valley like predators. The distinctive whine of their atmospheric engines cut through the morning calm, sending the blue beings scattering in confusion. Mark grabbed his equipment and raced toward the settlement, hoping to warn the creatures, but he was too late. The extraction team had already begun their clearing operation. The screams haunted him still. Blue bodies fell under precise bursts of pulse rifles, their primitive spears useless against modern weapons. Mark watched in horror as homes were demolished and adults were gunned down while shielding their young. The methodical nature of the slaughter suggested this wasn't the security team's first such operation. They moved with practiced efficiency, documenting their work with drones that hovered overhead, recording the destruction for corporate records. "Step aside, Reeves," Commander Hask had ordered when he spotted Mark at the edge of the carnage. Tall and lean with a precisely trimmed beard, Hask embodied corporate authority. His implants glinted beneath the skin of his temples, marking him as someone who had undergone extensive augmentation, a privilege reserved for those on executive career tracks. His eyes, cold and calculating, assessed Mark with professional detachment. "This isn't in your job description." 2 security officers grabbed Mark's arms, restraining him as he struggled to comprehend the scene before him. The settlement, vibrant with life just hours earlier, now lay in ruins. Bodies of the blue-skinned beings lay where they had fallen, their blood darkening the soil. Some had managed to flee toward the canyon walls, only to be cut down by precision fire from the dropships. Others had attempted to stand their ground, forming protective circles around their youngest members. None had survived. "What are you doing?" Mark had shouted, struggling against the officer's grip. Their augmented strength made resistance futile, but he couldn't stand by silently. "These are sentient beings. They have rights under interstellar code." Hask's laugh was cold, devoid of humor or humanity. He approached Mark slowly, stopping just beyond arm's reach. "Rights? Look around you, Reeves. Do you see any witnesses? As far as the company's concerned, this planet is uninhabited, perfect for strip mining." "I'm a witness," Mark replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'll report this." "No, you won't." Hask's certainty sent a chill through Mark. "Your psych profile indicates a strong tendency toward isolation and avoidance of conflict. You've never filed a complaint in 15 years. You're not going to start now." The casual way Hask referenced his psychological profile reminded Mark of how thoroughly the corporation monitored its employees. Every evaluation, every medical scan, every private communication, all fed into algorithms designed to predict behavior and identify potential problems. Mark had never considered how this information might be used against him. "You've been a valuable asset, Reeves," Hask continued. "Your survey work has opened 3 productive mining operations. The company appreciates your service." He gestured to the officers. "Take him back to the ship. We'll discuss his continued employment after the operation concludes." The meaning was clear. Once the massacre was complete, Mark would face a choice: comply with company directives or become another unfortunate casualty on a hostile world. No one would question the death of a surveyor on a frontier planet. Such accidents happen regularly. The corporation would send a standardized message to his emergency contact, a distant cousin on Europa he hadn't spoken to in years, expressing regret for the tragic incident and offering the standard death benefit, minus applicable fees for contract termination. In the chaos that followed, Mark had broken free, his survival instincts overriding the conditioning of 15 years. He drove his elbow into one guard's throat and wrenched away from the second, adrenaline temporarily granting him strength beyond his normal capacity. Then he was running, racing into the heart of the settlement as explosives detonated around him, tearing through structures and anyone unfortunate enough to be nearby. The guards shouted behind him, their voices fading as he zigzagged through the burning dwellings. Mark knew the settlement better than they did, having observed it for days. He used this knowledge now, ducking through passages too narrow for the guards' bulky combat exoskeletons. Most of the blue creatures had already fallen, but in a partially collapsed dwelling, he found a female clutching a small cub to her chest. Her eyes, large and filled with an almost human terror, met his. A spear protruded from her side, dark blood pulsing around the wound. Despite her injury, she maintained a protective stance, ready to defend her young with her final breath. One arm cradled the cub while the other held a crude dagger fashioned from bone, which she raised defensively as Mark approached. Mark raised his empty hands, trying to convey that he meant no harm. The universal gesture of peaceful intent appeared to register, though the female remained wary. Her breathing was labored, each inhalation causing a fresh trickle of blood from her wound. The cub, recognizing its mother's distress, emitted a series of high-pitched sounds that tore at Mark's heart. For several tense seconds, neither moved. Then, with deliberate slowness, she reached out, offering the trembling cub. A universal gesture that needed no translation. Save my child. The trust implicit in that action staggered Mark. This being, wounded by humans, chose to entrust her offspring to one of the same species rather than let the cub die with her. The weight of that responsibility settled on him as he carefully took the small creature, feeling its rapid heartbeat against his palms. Mark took the cub just as Hask appeared in the doorway, weapon raised. The commander's expression shifted from surprise to cold calculation as he assessed the situation. His gaze moved from Mark to the injured female, then to the cub. Recognition flashed across his features as he noticed the distinctive markings on the cub's chest, markings that differed from those of the other children Mark had observed in the settlement. Touching? The commander sneered, his weapon trained on Mark's chest. The pulse rifle hummed softly as its targeting system locked on. But futile. Step aside. That specimen is particularly valuable. No. Mark positioned himself between Hask and the injured mother. The cub now clutched protectively against him. Something fundamental had changed within him. After 15 years of complicity through inaction, he had found a line he could not cross. The realization brought with it an unexpected clarity. This ends now. It certainly does. Hask fired. The bolt grazed Mark's shoulder, sending him stumbling back against the dwelling's wall. The pain was immediate and intense, burning through his nervous system like liquid fire. The plasma discharge seared flesh and cauterized blood vessels simultaneously, preventing immediate bleeding but causing damage that would require medical attention. In that instant, the female creature lunged forward with surprising strength, driving a concealed bone dagger into Hask's throat. Both collapsed together, neither rising again. Hask's expression of shock remained fixed on his face, his augmentations sparking uselessly as their neural connections failed. More voices approached. Mark tucked the cub securely against his chest and ran, bullets cutting through the air around him. He ducked between structures, using the smoke from burning dwellings as cover. The cub remained remarkably quiet, as if understanding the need for stealth. Mark reached his survey vehicle and fled into the wastelands, the cub trembling against him. Behind them, the settlement burned, black smoke rising into the red sky like an accusation. The survey vehicle provided temporary escape, but not safety. Mark knew the corporation would track the vehicle's transponder once they discovered Hask's body. Standard protocol required all company vehicles to broadcast identification signals continuously, allowing headquarters to monitor their assets across planetary surfaces. Mark had disabled the primary transponder, but suspected the vehicle contained backup systems beyond his ability to locate. He drove deep into the Badlands, following a dry riverbed that wound between towering rock formations. The ancient watercourse provided natural concealment from aerial surveillance, its steep banks restricting scanner coverage. Eventually, the terrain became too rough for the vehicle. Mark gathered essential supplies, a canteen, emergency rations, basic medical supplies, a survival knife, and a rudimentary shelter sheet, before continuing on foot. He considered taking the vehicle's communication equipment, but decided against it. Any transmission would reveal their position more surely than the disabled transponder. Now, 3 days later, supplies dwindling and a company manhunt underway, Mark struggled across the rocky terrain. His communicator had picked up transmissions. They were closing in, tracking his vehicle's emission signature as he had feared. He'd abandoned it hours ago, continuing on foot toward the distant mountain range where the cub's people were rumored to have another settlement. The rugged landscape before him offered no easy path. Razor-sharp rock formations alternated with patches of treacherous scree that shifted underfoot. The atmosphere, thin and abrasive, made each breath an effort. Without his vehicle's environmental systems, Mark relied on a damaged respirator that provided minimal filtration against the planet's caustic dust. The sun was setting fast, bringing with it the bone-deep cold of Tharsis nights. Without shelter, neither he nor the cub would survive until morning. The temperature would plummet within hours, dropping well below freezing. Mark's environmental suit, damaged during his escape, could no longer regulate his body temperature effectively. The cub, though apparently better adapted to the planet's conditions, was still young and vulnerable. They needed protection from both the elements and pursuing Terra Nova forces. Mark spotted a small cave entrance partially hidden behind a rock outcropping. The opening was unremarkable, easily overlooked amid the chaotic geology of the region. He checked for signs of predators before ducking inside, carefully setting the cub down to inspect their shelter. The cub remained where he placed it, watching with those disconcertingly intelligent eyes as Mark explored the cave's interior. The cave extended deeper than he'd expected, widening into a larger chamber. The walls showed signs of previous occupation, scratch marks that might have been writing or art, and small niches that could have held tools or personal items. Whoever had used this space was long gone, but their presence lingered. Some of the markings resembled those Mark had observed in the destroyed settlement, suggesting this cave might once have served as an outpost for the blue-skinned beings. Perfect for tonight, at least. He returned to the entrance and carefully obscured their tracks before gathering the cub again. "Home sweet home," he murmured, settling against the rough wall. His body ached from days of constant movement, and his wounded shoulder throbbed painfully. The plasma burn had begun to develop an infection despite his best efforts to keep it clean. Streaks of red extended outward from the wound, and the surrounding tissue felt hot to the touch. Without proper medical attention, the infection would spread, potentially becoming life-threatening within days. At least for tonight. The cub blinked up at him, its oversized eyes reflecting what little light remained. For the first time, Mark got a proper look at the creature he'd risked everything to save. No larger than a human infant, the cub was covered in soft blue fur that darkened to indigo along its spine. 6-fingered hands ended in tiny claws, and its ears, pointed and alert, swiveled independently, tracking every sound. The face was almost feline in structure, with a short muzzle and whisker-like sensory appendages that twitched occasionally. Most striking were the markings on its chest, a complex pattern of lighter blue that formed a symmetrical design unlike any Mark had seen on the other cubs. These markings had drawn Hask's specific attention, suggesting they held some significance the commander recognized. Mark unwrapped his last ration bar and broke off a small piece, offering it to the cub. The creature sniffed cautiously before taking it, examining the food with obvious curiosity before nibbling experimentally. The ration bars, designed to meet human nutritional needs across a range of metabolic conditions, might not provide ideal nourishment for the alien physiology, but Mark hoped they contained nothing actively harmful. He watched anxiously as the cub consumed the unfamiliar food, ready to intervene if it showed any signs of distress. "That's it," Mark encouraged, watching as the cub gradually consumed the entire portion. "Not exactly gourmet, but it'll keep you going." As they shared the meager meal, Mark pondered their next move. The mountains were still at least 2 days' journey on foot, and he had no guarantee the cub's people would welcome them, or even that they existed. For all he knew, the settlement he'd witnessed being destroyed was the last of their kind. In that case, he had rescued the cub only to prolong its suffering. The thought troubled him deeply. What right did he have to make such decisions? A surveyor with no medical training, no knowledge of the species' nutritional needs, no understanding of their psychological development. His actions, however well-intentioned, might doom the cub to a slow, painful death, rather than the quick end it would have found in the settlement. The responsibility weighed on him, forcing confrontation with moral questions he had avoided throughout his corporate career. The cub finished eating and crawled onto Mark's lap, curling into a tight ball against his chest. Despite everything, Mark smiled. The trust this small being placed in him stirred something profound, a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. Whatever the future held, He would do everything in his power to ensure this child survived. The determination surprised him. After years of emotional detachment, this vulnerable creature had somehow breached his carefully constructed walls. Perhaps it was the simple innocence of the cub, or the desperate sacrifice of its mother. Whatever the reason, Mark found himself fully committed to this unexpected responsibility. "We'll figure this out," he promised softly, gently stroking the cub's fur. The texture was unlike anything he had encountered, softer than the finest Terran silk, with a subtle warmth that seemed to emanate from within. Somehow, sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by the cub's occasional whimpers and Mark's own vigilance. Every sound outside their hiding place sent his hand to the knife at his belt, his only weapon since leaving his standard-issue stunner in the abandoned vehicle. The stunner would have provided non-lethal defense options, but carrying it risked detection by corporate security scanners calibrated to locate their equipment. Twice during the night, he heard distant engines, search vehicles combing the wastelands for any sign of their quarry. Each time, the cub tensed against him, its keen hearing detecting the sounds before Mark's human ears could register them. During one period of wakefulness, Mark noticed the cub watching him with unusual intensity. When their eyes met, the cub placed a six-fingered hand against Mark's temple. The touch was gentle but deliberate, the small fingers pressing lightly against his skin. A strange tingling sensation spread through his mind, followed by a brief, disorienting flash of unfamiliar images. The settlement from a much lower perspective. A blue-skinned female, the cub's mother, singing in a language of clicks and rumbles, fear as the attackers came, and then Mark's own face, seen through the cub's eyes. The experience lasted only seconds but left Mark breathless, the foreign memories vivid and emotionally charged. Mark gasped, pulling back instinctively. The contact broke, and the images vanished, leaving him disoriented. The cub made a soft, apologetic sound and withdrew its hand, ears flattening against its head in a gesture that somehow communicated regret. "Was that you?" Mark whispered, staring at the small being with new understanding. His heart pounded with the implications. "Are you telepathic?" The cub didn't respond verbally, but something in its gaze suggested comprehension. Mark recalled rumors among frontier surveyors about species with psychic abilities, though Terra Nova officially dismissed such accounts as superstition. If the cub possessed such talents, even in rudimentary form, it might explain the company's interest in capturing, rather than simply eliminating all members of the species. Telepathic abilities had enormous potential applications, from communication to intelligence gathering to perhaps even warfare. A species that could be harvested for such abilities would be invaluable to any corporation with military contracts. The realization added urgency to their situation. If Terra Nova sought the cub for its telepathic potential, they would allocate significant resources to its recovery. Mark's status would shift from rogue employee to industrial saboteur, a classification that would justify extreme measures for his capture or elimination. Morning arrived with a blood-red sky. Mark shared their last water with the cub and peered cautiously out of the cave. The landscape appeared empty, but he knew that meant little. Terra Nova security forces possessed advanced camouflage technology that could render vehicles and personnel nearly invisible at distance. No sign of pursuers yet, but that didn't mean they weren't close. They needed to move. "Ready for another exciting day of running for our lives?" he asked the cub, who chirped in response, a sound Mark chose to interpret as agreement. The cub's resilience continued to impress him. Despite the trauma it had experienced in the harsh conditions of their flight, the small being maintained a remarkable adaptability. "Thought so. Let's go." They set off just as the second sun crested the horizon, casting harsh light across the landscape. The binary star system of Tharsis presented unique challenges for surface travel. During the brief period when both suns were visible, temperatures soared to dangerous levels. Mark had timed their departure to maximize progress before the worst heat arrived, planning to seek shelter during the dual-sun zenith. Mark kept to rocky ground when possible, avoiding the looser soil that would hold their tracks. The cub, surprisingly, kept pace beside him, scampering on all fours with remarkable speed when necessary and riding on his shoulders during difficult terrain. Its lightweight frame and natural agility made it better suited to the rugged landscape than Mark's human physiology. The cub occasionally paused, ears swiveling to track sounds beyond Mark's perception, providing early warning of potential dangers. By midday, the temperature had risen to nearly unbearable levels. Mark's water was gone, and his mouth felt like sandpaper. His vision occasionally blurred, suggesting the early stages of dehydration. Without water, his body could not process the emergency ration bars, leaving him increasingly weak despite the available calories. The infection in his shoulder had worsened, radiating heat and sending occasional pulses of sharp pain down his arm. The cub showed signs of distress too, its normally vibrant blue fur dulled and its movements slowing. "Just a little further," Mark encouraged, though he had no destination in mind beyond the next ridge. His voice rasped painfully in his dry throat. "We'll find water soon." The lie tasted bitter. He had no idea if water existed anywhere in this region. The survey data he'd reviewed before his assignment mentioned occasional springs and underground aquifers, but their locations weren't precisely mapped. Without proper equipment, finding water would require luck more than skill. His survey vehicle had contained sophisticated moisture detection instruments capable of identifying subsurface water from significant distances. On foot, with only basic survival gear, Mark had to rely on visual cues, changes in vegetation density, soil coloration, or geological formations that might indicate water presence. The ridge, when they reached it, offered no salvation, just more desolate terrain stretching toward the distant mountains. Mark's heart sank. Without water, they wouldn't last another day. The realization brought with it not fear, but a dull acceptance. He had made his choice in the settlement. If death was the consequence, he would face it knowing he had finally acted according to conscience rather than corporate directive. A soft tug at his pant leg drew his attention downward. The cub was pulling him in a different direction, away from their planned route. Its small face showed an intensity of purpose that transcended their communication barriers. "What is it?" Mark asked, kneeling despite the protest from his wounded shoulder. The movement sent a fresh wave of pain through his upper body, but he ignored it, focusing on the cub's behavior. The cub released his pant leg and scampered a few meters away, looking back expectantly. It repeated the motion twice more, clearly intending for Mark to follow. Mark hesitated. Following the cub meant heading away from the mountains, back toward more exposed terrain where Terra Nova search parties were likely operating. The direction would take them into a region of particularly chaotic geology, a maze of narrow canyons and unstable rock formations that his survey had designated as non-viable for extraction operations. But something in the creature's insistent movements convinced him. Perhaps the telepathic contact they'd shared had given the cub insight into his thoughts, helping it understand their desperate need for water. "All right," he conceded, rising painfully to his feet. His body protested the movement, muscles cramping from dehydration and overexertion. "Lead the way." The cub led him on a winding path through increasingly rough terrain, navigating with confidence through narrow passages between towering rock formations. The route grew more challenging with each step. Mark squeezed through gaps barely wide enough for his human frame, climbed over piles of shattered stone, and descended into ravines so deep that the sun's light barely penetrated. Several times he lost sight of the cub, only to find it waiting patiently around the next bend. The small being moved with complete assurance, as though following a map Mark couldn't see. Just when Mark began to doubt the wisdom of following an infant alien's guidance, they emerged into a small, hidden valley. And there, impossibly, was water, a small spring bubbling up from between rocks to form a shallow pool before disappearing underground again. The sight struck Mark with almost physical force. After days of desperate thirst, the clear liquid seemed miraculous. The valley itself was a revelation amid the barren landscape, a microclimate where the spring supported patches of alien vegetation. Purple-tinged plants clustered around the water source, their structure unlike Terran flora, but clearly serving similar functions. Some appeared to be primitive equivalents to ferns, while others resembled succulent species adapted to arid conditions. "How did you know?" Mark breathed, dropping to his knees beside the pool. The question encompassed more than just the water's location. How had the cub known they needed water? How had it navigated directly to this hidden valley? How had it understood the urgency of their situation? Mark tested the water carefully before drinking deeply, then watched as the cub submerged its entire head, drinking with obvious relief. The water tasted faintly metallic but was clean, filtered through layers of rock before emerging at the spring. The discovery renewed Mark's hope. If the cub could sense water, perhaps they had a chance after all. The ability suggested sensory capacities beyond human capabilities, possibly linked to the telepathic talent the cub had demonstrated earlier. Mark wondered what other abilities these beings possessed that Terra Nova coveted. He recalled Hask's specific interest in the cub, the commander's recognition of its chest markings. There was more happening here than a simple corporate land grab. Something about this species, particularly this cub, held value beyond the mineral resources of Tharsis 4. They rested by the spring until late afternoon, Mark refilling his canteen and washing their few remaining ration bars to soften them for the cub. He also took the opportunity to clean his infected shoulder wound, using the cool water to reduce inflammation and flush away accumulated debris. The relief was temporary but welcome, allowing him to move with less pain. The cub watched his self-treatment with apparent concern, occasionally approaching to inspect the wound before retreating. As they prepared to move on, a distant sound froze Mark in place, the distinctive whine of a dropship engine. He grabbed the cub and scrambled for cover among nearby rocks just as the vessel appeared overhead, its searchlights sweeping the terrain in precise patterns. The ship's design differed from standard Terra Nova survey vessels, sleeker, with enhanced sensor arrays visible on its underside. A specialized hunter-seeker designed for tracking and capture rather than transport or survey operations. "Stay down," he whispered to the cub, who seemed to understand, pressing itself flat against the ground. Its blue fur provided natural camouflage against the shadowed rocks, while Mark relied on the concealment of a narrow crevice. Their breathing synchronized unconsciously, both becoming absolutely still as the vessel approached. The dropship hovered directly above the spring, its spotlight illuminating the water's surface. Through narrow gaps between rocks, Mark watched as the ship deployed a small drone that collected water samples and scanned the surrounding area. The drone moved with mechanical precision, documenting the site methodically. Its sensors swept across their hiding place twice, pausing briefly each time before continuing its program pattern. Mark's heart pounded so loudly he feared the drone's sensors might detect it. The cub, however, remained perfectly still, its breathing shallow and controlled. The dropship hovered for several agonizing minutes before continuing its search pattern westward. Mark waited until the sound faded completely before emerging from hiding. His muscles protested the prolonged tension, cramping painfully as he straightened. "That was too close," he muttered, brushing dust from his clothes. His voice sounded unnaturally loud after the enforced silence. "They must have found the spring too. We need to move now." The encounter confirmed his fears. Terra Nova was using sophisticated tracking methods, probably following a trail of biological markers he and the cub had left behind. The water collection suggested they were analyzing DNA traces to track their movement patterns. Simply hiding wouldn't be enough. They needed to reach the mountains and find the cub's people before the corporation deployed even more resources to hunt them down. The specialized hunter-seeker indicated escalation of the pursuit. Terra Nova considered the cub valuable enough to justify significant operational expenses. They traveled through the night, guided by the 3 moons of Tharsis 4. The trio of satellites provided surprisingly good illumination, their combined light casting multiple shadows across the terrain. The cub rode on Mark's shoulders, occasionally making soft chirping sounds that almost resembled singing. Despite their dire situation, Mark found himself smiling at the creature's resilience. Children of any species, it seemed, possessed remarkable adaptability. The cub's capacity to find moments of joy amid crisis struck him as both touching and instructive. Perhaps there was wisdom in maintaining hope, even when circumstances suggested none was warranted. The night journey proved both blessing and curse. The cooler temperatures made travel less physically demanding, but the reduced visibility led to several near-disastrous missteps on treacherous terrain. Once, Mark barely caught himself at the edge of a deep crevasse, the loose stones beneath his feet giving way to reveal a drop that would have been fatal. The cub's warning chirp had alerted him just in time, its night vision apparently superior to his own. After that incident, Mark allowed the cub to guide their path more actively, following its lead rather than forcing his human perspective on their journey. As they traveled, Mark found his thoughts turning to the broader implications of what he had witnessed. If Terra Nova knew about the indigenous population of Tharsis IV, their operation constituted a direct violation of the Interstellar Colonial Code. Section 23 explicitly prohibited corporate exploitation of worlds with pre-industrial sentient populations. The penalties for such violations included massive fines, revocation of colonial licenses, and potential criminal charges for executives who authorized operations. But enforcement depended on evidence and witnesses. If Mark died on this planet, if the Cub's people were eliminated or remained hidden, Terra Nova would face no consequences. The corporation could exploit Tharsis IV's resources without restriction, perhaps even claiming credit for discovering the planet's unusual crystals without mentioning the civilization they destroyed to access them. Dawn revealed the mountains much closer than Mark had dared hope. His spirits lifted as he spotted patches of vegetation clinging to the lower slopes. Signs of a more hospitable environment. The mountains clearly captured moisture from the atmosphere more effectively than the surrounding lowlands, supporting ecosystems that might sustain both him and the cub until they could locate the rumored settlement. "We might make it after all," he told the cub, who responded by gently patting his head with a six-fingered hand. The gesture was so unexpectedly human that Mark laughed for the first time since the massacre. The sound startled both of them, seeming out of place in this harsh landscape, but the momentary lightness strengthened his resolve. They would survive this. They had to. They reached the foothills by midday and discovered a narrow path winding upward. The trail appeared deliberately constructed rather than formed by natural processes. Regular spacing of support stones along steeper sections suggested intelligent design, while occasional markers, small cairns topped with distinctively arranged stones, indicated intentional navigation aids. Mark followed it cautiously, knife ready. If there were indeed more of the Cub's people here, he couldn't be certain of their welcome. His species had just slaughtered members of their kind. They might not distinguish between different humans, especially when one appeared with a child that wasn't his. The path led to a sheltered plateau overlooking the vast expanse they had crossed. The elevated position offered strategic advantages, clear sightlines across the approaches, defensible high ground, and multiple retreat options via connecting ridges. Mark paused to rest, setting the cub down beside him. His shoulder wound, throbbed painfully despite the spring water treatment, and his legs trembled from exertion. The infection was advancing despite his efforts, sending occasional waves of feverish heat through his body. Without medical intervention, the condition would eventually become critical. The cub immediately began investigating a cluster of purple-leafed plants, chirping excitedly. The vegetation resembled what they had seen at the spring, but lusher, benefiting from the mountain's more favorable conditions. The plants grew in organized patterns that suggested cultivation rather than natural distribution. Someone tended these plots. "Food?" Mark asked, watching carefully as the cub pulled off several leaves and began to eat. The eagerness with which it consumed the vegetation confirmed his suspicion that their emergency rations had been inadequate for its dietary needs. After observing no ill effects, Mark tentatively tasted one himself. It was bitter but not unpleasant, with a surprisingly refreshing aftertaste. The plant's moisture content helped alleviate his persistent thirst, while its fibrous structure provided a sense of fullness his ration bars had lacked. The cub moved to another plant variety, this one bearing small pod-like structures. It split one open to reveal seeds within, which it consumed with obvious relish. Mark followed suit, finding the seeds had a nutty flavor reminiscent of Terran almonds. The nutritional value was impossible to determine without equipment, but the cub's enthusiastic consumption suggested compatibility with its physiology. Mark harvested several leaves and seed pods, storing them in his pack for later consumption. They continued their ascent, finding more edible plants along the way. The path became better defined, with occasional structures that might have served as rest areas or shelter from storms. The air grew cooler and richer with oxygen, easing Mark's labored breathing. The increased oxygen content helped combat his fatigue, though the infection in his shoulder continued to drain his strength. By late afternoon, they had climbed high enough to spot a thin column of smoke rising from a sheltered valley ahead, evidence of habitation. Mark approached cautiously, the cub now walking beside him. As they crested a ridge, he dropped to a prone position, pulling the cub down with him. Below, nestled against the mountainside, stood a settlement much like the one he had seen destroyed. Blue-skinned figures moved about their daily tasks, some carrying spears or bows, others tending to structures built half into the rock face itself. The architecture blended seamlessly with the natural environment, making the settlement nearly invisible from certain angles. The dwellings incorporated existing rock formations, augmented with constructed elements that matched the surrounding geology in color and texture. The settlement was larger than the valley community, with perhaps 50 structures visible from Mark's vantage point. Unlike the previous settlement, this one showed signs of defensive preparation, lookout positions on higher ground, a perimeter of sharpened stakes, and warriors patrolling in regular patterns. These people expected trouble. Perhaps news of the Valley Massacre had reached them, or perhaps they had previous encounters with humans that taught them caution. Either way, their preparedness might work against Mark's attempt to seek their help. "Your people," Mark whispered to the cub, who stared down with obvious recognition, making a series of excited clicks and chirps. The vocalization contained complex modulations that suggested linguistic structure rather than simple emotional expression. The sound carried farther than Mark intended. Several heads turned in their direction, and suddenly a group of warriors was racing up the slope, weapons raised. Mark considered running but knew they'd never outpace these beings on their home territory. Their only hope lay in peaceful contact. He placed the cub slightly behind him, hoping to indicate protection rather than captivity, and stood to face the approaching warriors. Mark stood slowly, raising empty hands. "We come in peace," he called out, knowing they wouldn't understand his words but hoping his posture conveyed his intentions. He kept his movements deliberate and non-threatening, maintaining eye contact with the lead warrior without staring aggressively. The warriors formed a semicircle around them, spears pointed at Mark's chest. Each warrior stood nearly 7 feet tall, their blue skin adorned with intricate patterns that might have been tattoos or natural markings. Their eyes, large and multifaceted like the cub's, assessed him with intelligent wariness. The warriors wore minimal clothing, simple garments that left their limbs unencumbered for combat. Some displayed what appeared to be battle scars, pale lines against their blue skin that spoke of previous conflicts. The cub, surprisingly, stayed by his side rather than running to its own kind. This seemed to confuse the warriors, whose weapons remained steady, but whose expressions showed uncertainty. They exchanged rapid vocalizations, their language a complex mixture of clicks, rumbles, and subtle harmonic tones. Several warriors gestured toward the cub, particularly the markings on his chest, which provoked animated discussion. The standoff broke when an elderly figure emerged from behind the warriors. Taller than the others, with skin faded to a pale azure and intricate patterns carved into the leather garments covering his thin frame. He carried no weapon but commanded immediate respect. The warriors parted to let him pass, though their spears remained trained on Mark. The elder's movements displayed the deliberate grace of advanced age, each step measured yet confident. His eyes, slightly clouded but intensely focused, examined Mark with unsettling thoroughness. The elder studied Mark with unnerving intensity before his gaze fell to the cub. Recognition flickered across his features, followed by what Mark could only interpret as shock. The elder made a series of sounds, and the cub responded with similar vocalizations, though remaining firmly by Mark's side. The exchange continued for several moments, the cub occasionally gesturing toward Mark with obvious emphasis. Mark carefully knelt, encouraging the cub to step forward. "I believe this little one belongs with you," he said gently. He made no attempt to push the cub toward them, allowing it to make its own decision. Instead of running to the elder, the cub grabbed Mark's hand with both of its own, making an insistent chirping sound. The elder's eyes widened further, and the warriors shifted restlessly, clearly unsettled by this development. The cub's attachment to a human violated their expectations and perhaps their cultural norms. One of the warriors stepped forward, spear still raised, and spoke in a series of clicks and low rumbles that sounded threatening even without translation. His posture radiated aggression, and several other warriors moved to support him. The situation balanced on a knife's edge, with violence a real possibility despite Mark's peaceful approach. The cub pressed closer to Mark, seemingly sensing the danger. The elder responded sharply, causing the warrior to back down reluctantly. The rebuke carried authority that transcended the language barrier, silencing the warrior immediately. The elder turned his attention back to Mark and the cub, his expression thoughtful. With deliberate movements, the elder approached until he stood directly before Mark. Up close, Mark could see the intricate patterns of lighter blue that swirled across the being's skin, and the depth of wisdom in his large, multifaceted eyes. The patterns resembled those on the cub's chest but were more elaborate, suggesting possible kinship or shared lineage. The elder's age was evident in the fine network of wrinkles around his eyes and the slight translucency of his skin, through which Mark could discern the movement of fluids in vessels analogous to human blood vessels. The elder extended a six-fingered hand, palm up. The gesture appeared ritualistic rather than merely functional. Mark hesitated, then placed his own hand atop it. The contact sent a strange tingling sensation up his arm, not unpleasant, but definitely alien. It reminded him of the cub's earlier attempt at communication, but stronger and more controlled, like comparing a child's scribbles to a master calligrapher's work. Images flooded Mark's mind: the settlement in the valley, the attack, the cub's mother. He realized with a start that the elder was communicating telepathically, reading the recent past directly from Mark's memories. The experience was disorienting, but not painful, as though someone were quickly flipping through pages of a book written in his consciousness. The elder's mental presence felt ancient and vastly complex, capable of processing information at speeds that made Mark's human cognition seem glacial by comparison. The elder's mental presence lingered on certain moments: Mark's decision to hide the settlement's existence, his attempt to intervene during the massacre, his protection of the cub during their journey. The assessment felt thorough but not invasive, focused primarily on Mark's interactions with the cub and its people rather than his personal history. Occasional emotional responses colored the elder's mental touch: sorrow at the destruction, gratitude for Mark's protection of the cub, curiosity about his motivations. When the elder withdrew his hand, his expression had softened. He turned to the warriors and spoke at length, gesturing toward Mark and the cub. Whatever he said caused a ripple of reaction, some nodding, others clearly objecting. The discussion grew animated, with several warriors speaking simultaneously. Mark couldn't understand the words, but the emotional tenor was clear. They were debating his fate with significant disagreement about the proper course of action. One warrior, larger and more heavily scarred than the others, stepped forward aggressively, pointing at Mark while making angry vocalizations. The warrior's hostility required no translation. He wanted Mark dead or removed, regardless of his actions regarding the cub. Mark tensed, preparing for an attack. The cub, sensing the danger, pressed closer to Mark's leg, making sounds that seemed defensive or possibly pleading. The elder listened impassively before responding, with a single sharp command that silenced all debate. The authority in that sound transcended language barriers, and even the aggressive warrior stepped back, though his expression remained hostile. The elder made a sweeping gesture that encompassed the entire group, then pointed toward the settlement below. The meaning seemed clear. The discussion would continue there, not on an exposed mountain ridge where Terra Nova forces might observe them. The elder turned back to Mark and gestured toward the settlement below, clearly an invitation. The movement carried ceremonial weight, not merely practical direction, but formal acknowledgement of Mark's status as something other than an enemy. "Thank you," Mark said, rising to his feet. Pain shot through his shoulder as he straightened, reminding him of his worsening infection. The cub immediately scrambled up to perch on his shoulder, a position that seemed to surprise the watching warriors. The small being's comfort with him, its obvious preference for his company over that of its own kind, appeared to challenge some fundamental assumption among the blue-skinned people. They descended to the settlement in formation, warriors ahead and behind. Mark noticed the inhabitants stopping their activities to stare as he passed. Children, cubs only slightly larger than his companion, were quickly ushered into dwellings, doors sealed. Behind them, adults watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Mark understood their reaction. To them, he represented the species that had just committed atrocities against their kind. Their restraint in not immediately killing him spoke to a level of civilization that many humans would do well to emulate. The settlement's interior revealed sophisticated organization, despite the seemingly primitive technology. Water flowed through carefully engineered channels, providing irrigation for cultivated food plants and meeting domestic needs. Waste was managed through separate drainage systems that prevented contamination. The dwellings, though constructed from local stone and plant materials, displayed complex architectural understanding, load-bearing walls positioned precisely, ventilation systems that maintained comfortable interior conditions, storage areas designed to preserve perishable items. The elder led them to a large central structure built directly into the mountainside. Inside, a fire burned in a stone pit, illuminating walls covered with elaborate paintings depicting hunts, celestial events, and what appeared to be the history of their people. The images showed the blue beings arriving on Tharsis IV in vessels that resembled seed pods falling from space, suggesting they might not be native to this world either. Subsequent panels depicted adaptation to the harsh environment, conflicts with native predators, and eventual establishment of settlements. The artistic style combined naturalistic representation with symbolic elements, creating a narrative that Mark found surprisingly comprehensible despite the cultural differences. Mark was directed to sit on a woven mat near the fire. The cub remained close, occasionally reaching up to touch his face with gentle fingers, as if reassuring itself of his continued presence. The constant physical contact seemed important to the small being, perhaps providing security amid the unfamiliar situation. Despite being among its own kind, the cub clearly considered Mark its primary caregiver, a bond formed through shared survival that transcended species boundaries. More blue-skinned beings entered, each adorned with different markings that Mark assumed denoted rank or function. They arranged themselves in a circle around him, the elder seated directly opposite. The formal arrangement suggested a council or tribunal rather than casual gathering. Mark recognized the aggressive warrior from earlier, now sitting at the elder's right hand, a position that likely indicated leadership status. The warrior's hostility remained evident in his posture and occasional glares toward Mark. What followed was clearly some form of council meeting, with much debate that Mark couldn't understand. The elder occasionally glanced his way, sometimes gesturing for the cub to approach him. Each time the cub would do so reluctantly, communicate briefly, then return quickly to Mark's side. The elder appeared troubled by this behavior, though not angry. The cub's attachment to Mark seemed to violate expectations or perhaps cultural norms, creating a situation for which the council had no precedent. Hours passed. Mark's shoulder wound, neglected during their journey, began throbbing painfully again. He tried to maintain a stoic expression, not wanting to appear weak before these beings who placed such obvious value on strength and resilience. The infection was advancing despite his earlier cleaning, sending waves of feverish heat through his body that alternated with chills. The cub, however, noticed his discomfort and made a distressed sound that drew the elder's attention. At the elder's command, a blue-skinned female with marking suggesting a healer's role approached Mark. She examined his shoulder wound without touching it, then spoke rapidly to the elder. Whatever she reported caused immediate concern among the council members. The healer's assessment apparently conveyed the seriousness of Mark's condition. Without treatment, the infection would continue spreading, potentially becoming life-threatening within days. The council's debate took on new urgency, with several members gesturing emphatically toward Mark. The debate concluded with apparent consensus. Food was brought, a stew of unfamiliar roots and what might have been meat, served in rough clay bowls. The preparation suggested sophisticated understanding of nutrition and food preservation, with aromatic herbs that might serve medicinal as well as flavoring purposes. Mark ate cautiously, finding the flavor strong but not unpleasant. The cub ate with enthusiasm, occasionally offering Mark choice morsels from its own bowl, a gesture that seemed to surprise the watching council members. The sharing of food carried symbolic significance among many species. Perhaps here, too, it represented connection or family bonds. After the meal, the healer returned with materials to treat Mark's wound. She indicated through gestures that he should remove his upper clothing. Mark complied, revealing the plasma burn that had festered during their journey. The wound looked worse than he'd realized. Angry red lines spreading outward from the primary injury indicated advancing infection that his immune system couldn't contain. The damaged tissue had begun to necrotize around the edges, emitting a subtle but distinct odor of decay. The healer cleaned the wound with a solution that burned fiercely, causing Mark to clench his teeth against the pain. The cub made distressed sounds and tried to intervene, but the healer gently pushed it aside, continuing her work with practiced efficiency. She applied a poultice of crushed plants before binding the shoulder with a soft material that resembled fabric, but seemed to be of vegetable origin. The dressing adhered to itself without additional fasteners, conforming perfectly to the contours of his shoulder. Almost immediately, Mark felt relief. The burning sensation receded, replaced by a pleasant numbness that spread through his upper body. Whatever the poultice contained, it was far more effective than the standard-issue antibiotics in his abandoned medical kit. His mind cleared as the fever began to subside, allowing him to focus more completely on the council proceedings. As night fell, the council seemed to reach a decision. The elder rose and approached Mark once more, extending both hands this time. The gesture carried ceremonial significance, more formal than the earlier contact. Understanding the gesture, Mark placed his hands in the elder's, bracing for the mental contact. The connection established immediately, stronger than before, suggesting the elder had attuned himself to Mark's mind during their previous exchange. This time, instead of taking memories, the elder shared them. Mark saw the history of these people, their migration to the mountains generations ago, fleeing some ancient cataclysm. He saw their struggles to adapt, their development of a society in harmony with the harsh environment. Most significantly, he saw their awareness of human presence on their world. They had been observing Terra Nova's operations for months, watching with growing concern as the corporation's activities expanded across their traditional territories. The elder's mental communication conveyed complex emotions: wariness regarding humans as a species, gratitude for Mark's specific actions, concern for the cub's unusual attachment to him, and uncertainty about the future. Beneath these immediate concerns lay deeper knowledge: the blue being's origin on another world, their arrival on Tharsis 4 thousands of years earlier, when their home planet became uninhabitable, their deliberate choice to abandon advanced technology in favor of a simpler existence that wouldn't deplete their new home's resources. The elder showed Mark the cub's significance, not just any child, but one born with rare genetic markers that indicated potential for advanced telepathic abilities. The markings on its chest, similar to the elder's own, identified it as part of a lineage traditionally responsible for maintaining their species' collective memory and mediating disputes. Such children were rare and precious, raised communally with careful attention to developing their natural gifts. The cub's mother had been a promising telepath herself, chosen to raise her child in the valley settlement specifically because of its isolation from human activities. The attack had shattered not only lives, but potentially important cultural continuity. The elder withdrew his hands, leaving Mark gasping from the intensity of the shared vision. When he recovered, the elder spoke directly to him. Though Mark couldn't understand the words, the meaning was somehow clear. "You are welcome here, protector of our child." The telepathic connection had established a rudimentary translation function that allowed Mark to grasp the essence, if not the specific words of the elder's speech. "The company won't stop," Mark warned, hoping his meaning, if not his words, would be understood. He projected mental images of Terra Nova's resources and determination, trying to convey the danger still facing the settlement. "They'll find this place eventually." The elder's expression indicated comprehension. He made a gesture that encompassed the entire settlement, then pointed to the cub and to Mark himself. A warrior stepped forward, offering Mark a spear, not as a threat, but as a gift. The weapon represented exceptional craftsmanship, its stone tip napped to razor sharpness and secured to the shaft with bindings that would never loosen in use. The handle portion was wrapped in a material that provided exceptional grip without adding weight. The meaning was unmistakable: "We will fight together." Mark accepted the weapon, feeling its perfect balance. Despite its primitive appearance, the spear represented sophisticated understanding of materials and physics, Optimized for both throwing and close combat, the craftsmanship spoke to generations of refinement, each small improvement building on previous knowledge. That night, Mark was given a small dwelling of his own, the cub insisting on staying with him rather than rejoining its own kind. As he settled onto the surprisingly comfortable sleeping platform, the cub curled against his side, Mark reflected on how completely his life had changed in just a few days. He had come to this planet as a corporate surveyor, concerned only with finding valuable resources. Now he was a fugitive, adopted by an alien culture, planning to defend them against the very company that had employed him. The irony might have amused him under different circumstances. His entire identity had transformed, from isolated technician, methodically cataloging exploitation opportunities to protector of an endangered community and surrogate parent to an alien child. The transformation brought with it not anxiety, but a strange sense of rightness, as though he had finally found his proper place in the universe. Sleep came easier than it had in days, the relative safety of the settlement allowing Mark to truly rest for the first time since the massacre. The herbal treatment for his wound continued working throughout the night, accelerating the healing process far beyond what human medicine could achieve. By morning, the infection had noticeably receded, the angry red streaks fading to pink. The wound itself had begun to close, new tissue forming along the edges where previously there had been only necrosis. He woke to urgent chirping and the cub tugging at his sleeve. Outside, the settlement was in a flurry of activity. Warriors gathered weapons while others hurriedly packed supplies into bundles. Families embraced in what appeared to be hasty farewells. The atmosphere crackled with tension, not panic but focused urgency that suggested immediate threat. The elder appeared at his doorway, gesturing urgently for Mark to follow. They hurried to a high point overlooking the approach to the settlement. The elder handed Mark a device that resembled primitive binoculars, crafted from some sort of crystalline material that magnified distant objects with surprising clarity. The optical properties of the crystal surpassed anything Mark had encountered in human technology, providing magnification without distortion across a broad visual spectrum. Through it, he could detect heat signatures as well as visible light, creating a comprehensive image of the terrain below. Through the crystal, Mark saw what had alarmed them, a column of vehicles moving steadily across the distant plain, heading directly toward the mountains. Terra Nova's extraction team, at least 30 strong, with heavy equipment in tow. Among the vehicles, Mark recognized specialized units designed for capturing and containing biological specimens. The company wasn't just coming to eliminate witnesses, they wanted samples. Several vehicles carried equipment Mark recognized from his surveying days, deep scanning arrays capable of detecting mineral deposits through significant layers of rock. But they had been modified, their sensors recalibrated for biological rather than geological signatures. They were hunting the blue-skinned beings specifically, not just clearing territory for mining operations. "They found us," Mark said grimly, returning the viewing device. "Probably tracked our path from the spring." He gestured toward the approaching vehicles, then to his own shoulder, trying to convey that his wound might have left a biological trail the company could follow. The infection had caused his body to shed dead cells and fluids, creating a detectable path despite his attempts to conceal their tracks. The elder made a series of rapid commands, sending warriors running in all directions. To Mark's surprise, the settlement wasn't being evacuated. Instead, the blue-skinned beings were preparing defensive positions, distributing weapons, and setting up what appeared to be elaborate traps along the approach paths. Children and elders were being moved to more sheltered locations within the settlement, but the able-bodied remained, preparing for battle rather than flight. Their determination impressed Mark, who had assumed they would abandon the settlement rather than face Terra Nova's superior weapons. The elder turned to Mark, gesturing toward him, then to the mountainside above the settlement, then making a sweeping motion toward the approaching vehicles. He wanted Mark's help planning their defense. The request made practical sense. Mark understood Terra Nova's tactics and technology in ways the indigenous population couldn't, regardless of their intelligence or courage. His knowledge might be the difference between successful defense and annihilation. Mark hesitated. His experience was in geological surveying, not military tactics. His knowledge of Terra Nova's security operations came from observation rather than training. But 15 years of frontier work had taught him the capabilities and limitations of Terra Nova's security forces. He knew their standard operational patterns, their equipment vulnerabilities, and their typical responses to resistance. This knowledge, however incomplete, might provide the settlement's defenders with critical advantages. For the next several hours, Mark worked alongside the warriors, using his knowledge of Terra Nova tactics to strengthen their defenses. He showed them how to create rock slides that could be triggered at the right moment, how to set ambush points at natural choke points in the terrain, how to use the environment to maximum advantage against technologically superior forces. He explained the vulnerabilities of different vehicle types, weak points in armor, limited sensor coverage, dependency on specific environmental conditions for optimal function. Communication remained challenging, but the Blue Warriors quickly grasped his intentions when he demonstrated with simple models built from stones and sticks. They adapted his suggestions to their own fighting style with impressive speed, improving upon his basic ideas with innovations that revealed deep understanding of their home territory. Their spatial reasoning abilities seemed particularly acute, allowing them to conceptualize complex three-dimensional battle scenarios from minimal information. They showed him weapons he hadn't seen before, not just spears and bows, but cleverly designed slings that could hurl specially shaped stones with devastating accuracy, and blowpipes that delivered paralyzing darts coated with secretions from local plants. Though primitive compared to Terra Nova's firearms, these weapons offered significant advantages in the hands of warriors who had mastered them through lifelong practice. The darts particularly interested Mark. The paralytic compound might affect human nervous systems differently than those of local predators, potentially creating unexpected advantages in combat. Mark also learned about the settlement's defensive structures. What had appeared to be simple stone walls actually incorporated sophisticated engineering principles. Some sections could be deliberately collapsed to channel attackers into killing zones. Others contained hidden observation posts that allowed defenders to track enemy movements undetected. The settlement itself had been constructed with defense in mind, its layout confusing to outsiders but intuitively navigable for residents. Multiple escape routes existed, concealed from casual observation but accessible in emergencies. By nightfall, they were as ready as they could be. The company forces had established a base camp at the foot of the mountains and would likely begin their ascent at dawn. Aerial reconnaissance had already begun, with drones mapping the terrain in preparation for the ground assault. The settlement's natural camouflage provided some protection against casual observation, but Terra Nova's advanced scanning technology would eventually penetrate these defenses. Time was limited, and both Mark and the Blue Warriors knew it. The cub stayed close to Mark throughout the preparations, watching with solemn eyes. During a brief respite, the elder approached with another blue-skinned adult, a female whose markings and bearing suggested high status. She studied Mark intently before focusing on the cub, who chirped a greeting but made no move to approach her. The female's expression showed complex emotions: concern, confusion, perhaps even hurt at the cub's obvious preference for Mark over one of its own kind. The elder spoke softly to Mark while gesturing between the female and the cub. Though the words were incomprehensible, the message was clear through the lingering telepathic connection. This is the cub's aunt, sister to its fallen mother. The resemblance was subtle but unmistakable, something in the pattern of facial features and the particular shade of her skin that matched the cub's fur. She had journeyed from another settlement upon receiving news of her sister's death, arriving only days before Mark and the cub. Her presence explained some of the council's urgency. She represented external interests in their decision regarding Mark and the cub. Mark knelt, gently encouraging the cub to greet its relative. "She's your family," he said softly. "Your real family." The words caught in his throat unexpectedly. Over their journey, he had developed genuine attachment to the small being, not just responsibility, but affection that transcended species barriers. The prospect of separation, though logical and probably necessary, produced a surprising ache of loss. The cub did so with obvious reluctance, exchanging brief touches with the female before scurrying back to Mark's side. The female's expression showed emotions Mark couldn't quite interpret: sorrow, perhaps, or resignation. Whatever expectations she had brought to this reunion, the reality clearly disappointed them. The cub's attachment to Mark appeared stronger than blood ties to its own kind, a situation that created evident discomfort among the watching blue-skinned beings. The female's expression was difficult to read, but she offered Mark what might have been a bow before departing. The gesture seemed to acknowledge his role in the cub's life, however temporary or inappropriate that might be from her cultural perspective. The elder watched the interaction with thoughtful eyes before placing a hand briefly on Mark's shoulder, a gesture of approval, perhaps, or simply acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between human and cub. That night, final preparations were made. The settlement's children and elders were moved to caves higher up the mountain, a last refuge if the defense failed. Warriors painted their bodies with symbols Mark didn't understand, but recognized as having ritual significance. The patterns weren't merely decorative but seemed to serve practical purposes as well, providing camouflage in certain environments and perhaps signaling specific combat roles to fellow warriors. He himself was brought before the elder, who used a thumb dipped in blue pigment to mark Mark's forehead with a symbol matching the one on the cub's chest, officially declaring him the cub's protector. The gesture carried profound meaning, Mark sensed. He wasn't simply being accepted as an ally, he was being incorporated into their kinship structure, given a defined role within their society. The warriors' attitudes toward him shifted subtly afterward, moving from wary acceptance to something closer to respect. The ceremony created a formal relationship that transcended his status as human outsider, establishing obligations and rights that the blue-skinned beings recognized regardless of species. Mark spent the remaining hours before dawn checking and rechecking their defensive preparations. The cub accompanied him, occasionally offering suggestions through gestures that proved surprisingly insightful. Despite its youth, the cub possessed an intuitive understanding of strategy that complemented Mark's technical knowledge. Several times it identified weaknesses in their preparations that Mark had overlooked: blind spots in coverage, unstable support structures, approach routes inadequately monitored. The cub's contributions reinforced Mark's growing suspicion that its telepathic abilities extended beyond simple communication to include enhanced spatial awareness and perhaps limited precognition. The night passed too quickly. Before first light, warriors took their positions along the defensive perimeter. The atmosphere was tense but disciplined. No panic, no unnecessary conversation, just quiet determination to protect their home. Mark admired their courage. These beings faced weapons centuries beyond their technological level, yet showed no hesitation in standing their ground. Their commitment to defending their home and way of life transcended reasonable calculation of odds, drawing instead on deeper values that Mark found himself sharing despite his brief association with their culture. Dawn brought the expected advance. Terra Nova forces began ascending the path toward the settlement, heavily armed and moving with military precision. Assault teams in the lead carried riot shields and short-range weapons, suitable for close combat in confined spaces. Behind them came specialists operating scanning equipment, presumably seeking the specific biological signatures they had been tasked to locate. Heavy weapons teams provided support from the rear, their equipment suggesting preparation for significant resistance. Mark observed from a hidden position, the cub secure in a cave behind him. The tactical display unfolding below matched Terra Nova's security doctrine precisely. Standard formation for pacification operations in hostile territory. The predictability gave Mark confidence in the defense plan. If the company forces followed their usual protocols, they would advance directly into the traps he and the warriors had prepared. "Stay here," he instructed firmly, knowing the cub understood even if it couldn't respond in his language. The small being had demonstrated increasingly sophisticated comprehension of human speech over their time together. "I'll come back for you." The cub made a mournful sound but obeyed, retreating deeper into the cave as Mark joined the warriors at their first defensive position. His shoulder, significantly improved after the healer's treatment, allowed him reasonable mobility, though prolonged combat would still prove challenging. The spear he had been given compensated somewhat for his disadvantage, allowing engagement from greater distance than the knife he had carried previously. The battle began with a show of force from Terra Nova, warning shots fired into the air and a loudspeaker announcement demanding surrender of the fugitive surveyor and any stolen company property. The corporate choice of words, referring to a sentient being as property, reinforced Mark's conviction. Whatever happened today, he was on the right side of this conflict. The dehumanizing language reflected fundamental corporate philosophy. Everything and everyone existed only in relation to profit potential. The blue-skinned beings were not people with rights and dignity, but merely assets to be acquired or obstacles to be removed. The response came in the form of a barrage of stones from hidden slings, striking with precision at the lead soldiers. The projectiles, while primitive, achieved velocities sufficient to penetrate standard-issue body armor at weak points, joints, neck seals, sensor arrays. In the confusion that followed, the first trap was sprung, a cascade of boulders that crushed the foremost vehicle and blocked the narrow path. The landslide separated the advance team from their heavy weapon support, creating temporary tactical advantage for the defenders. Terra Nova responded with organized fire, but their superior weapons were partially nullified by the terrain. The Blue Warriors used their knowledge of the mountain paths to appear and disappear, striking quickly before retreating to new positions. Their movements seemed choreographed, suggesting extensive preparation and possibly telepathic coordination. No verbal commands were necessary. Each warrior intuitively understood their role in the larger defensive strategy, adjusting as needed to changing battlefield conditions. Mark moved between defensive points, coordinating the natives' efforts. His presence clearly unnerved the company forces, who had expected to find him cowering with the aliens, not leading them in battle. He heard his name mentioned repeatedly over their communication channels, which he monitored using a comm link taken from a fallen soldier. The security team's confusion regarding his role provided psychological advantage, disrupting their operational assumptions and forcing continuous tactical reassessment. Reeves, Commander Voss, Hask's replacement, called out during a lull. A tall woman with augmented limbs and a tactical computer integrated into her armor, Voss had a reputation for ruthless efficiency in corporate security operations. Her presence indicated the importance Terra Nova placed on this mission. She typically commanded larger operations with strategic significance. Surrender now and the company might show leniency. Continue this madness and you'll die with these creatures. Mark's response was to signal the warriors, who launched another coordinated attack from multiple positions simultaneously. The synchronized assault briefly overwhelmed Terra Nova's defensive perimeter, forcing them to fall back to secondary positions with casualties. The retreat, while tactical rather than strategic, boosted defender morale substantially. These primitive beings had forced a technologically superior force to yield ground, proof that their defense plan could succeed despite the odds. The battle raged throughout the morning, neither side gaining decisive advantage. Terra Nova had firepower, but were fighting on unfamiliar, treacherous terrain. The Blue Warriors had intimate knowledge of the environment, but were facing weapons centuries beyond their technological level. The casualties mounted on both sides. Several warriors had fallen to pulse rifle fire, while Terra Nova had lost perhaps a dozen personnel to various defensive measures. The company clearly hadn't expected such effective resistance, and their operations showed increasing frustration as the engagement continued without the quick resolution they had anticipated. By midday, both sides had sustained significant casualties. Mark had taken a grazing wound to his thigh but kept moving, knowing that the moment he showed weakness, morale would suffer. The injury burned with each step but remained superficial, unlike his shoulder wound. He had just finished helping set another rockslide trap when a warrior raced up to him, gesturing urgently toward the settlement. Mark followed at a run, dread building as they approached the dwellings. Something had gone wrong. The defensive plan had focused on keeping Terra Nova forces away from the settlement itself, engaging them on the approach paths where the Blue Warriors held terrain advantage. If fighting had reached the settlement, some element of the corporate assault had bypassed their carefully prepared positions. They found chaos. A Terra Nova squad had somehow circled around their defenses and attacked from behind, reaching the settlement itself. Bodies, both human and alien, lay where they had fallen. The invaders had been repelled, but at terrible cost. Several dwellings burned, the flames threatening to spread to adjacent structures. Warriors and civilians worked frantically to contain the fires, using water from the settlement's or irrigation system. The wounded, mostly civilians caught in the attack, were being treated by healers working with remarkable efficiency despite the confusion. The Elder's dwelling had been specifically targeted. Inside, Mark found the old alien alive but badly wounded, blue blood seeping from a chest wound. The injury appeared deliberately inflicted, not random combat damage but specific attempt to eliminate leadership. The Elder grabbed Mark's wrist with surprising strength, pulling him closer to establish mental contact one final time. The message was clear. They came for the cub. Protect it. The Elder's mental voice carried desperation beneath its customary dignity. The attack on the settlement hadn't been merely tactical advantage, but specifically aimed at capturing the cub. Terra Nova knew about the telepathic abilities and sought the cub for those talents. The Elder's dying concern focused not on his own fate or even the settlement's survival, but on preventing the cub's capture. "Where?" Mark demanded aloud. "Where is the cub?" The Elder's mental image showed the female, the cub's aunt, fleeing toward the upper caves with several children, Terra Nova soldiers in pursuit. Another image, a specific cave entrance hidden behind a waterfall higher up the mountain. The location would be difficult to reach but provided greater safety than the compromised main refuge. The Elder believed the female had taken the children there when the settlement's defenses were breached. Mark squeezed the Elder's shoulder once before racing out, grabbing a fallen warrior's bow and quiver as he went. The weapon, while primitive, offered advantages in the mountainous terrain. Quiet operation, unlimited ammunition if he could recover arrows, and effectiveness at ranges where his spear would be useless. The path to the upper caves was steep and exposed in places, forcing him to move carefully despite his urgency. Each step on his wounded leg sent fresh pain through his body, but Mark pushed through it, focusing on the need to reach the cub before Terra Nova's soldiers. He heard the confrontation before he saw it, human voices shouting commands, the distinctive sound of weapons being armed, and the higher-pitched cries of frightened alien children. The sounds echoed off rock faces, making precise location difficult, but Mark followed the increasing volume toward a narrow plateau above the main settlement. Cresting a ridge, Mark saw them. 3 Terra Nova soldiers had cornered the female, and 5 cubs against the rock face near the waterfall. The cub he had rescued was among them, partially hidden behind the adult female, who stood protectively before the group, a broken spear in her hands. Her posture was defensive, but not submissive, ready to die protecting her charges if necessary. The soldiers had their weapons trained on the group but hadn't fired, suggesting they wanted captives rather than casualties. "Move aside," one soldier was saying, weapon raised. His armor identified him as squad leader, responsible for tactical decisions in field operations. "We only want the marked one." He gestured toward Mark's cub, visible behind the female. The specific interest confirmed the Elder's mental message. Terra Nova sought the cub for its telepathic potential. Mark knocked an arrow, took careful aim, and loosed it in one fluid motion. The shaft took the speaker in the throat, dropping him instantly. The precision shot penetrated the narrow gap between helmet and body armor, striking the vulnerable throat with lethal force. Before the others could react, Mark had sent a second arrow into the shoulder of another soldier, spinning him around with the impact. The shot was less effective against the armored target but created crucial distraction. The third soldier turned, firing wildly in Mark's direction. Pulse rifle bolts chipped rock around him, sending fragments flying dangerously close to his position. Mark ducked behind a boulder as rounds continued impacting nearby, creating a hail of stone splinters that cut his exposed skin. When the firing paused, he rolled to a new position and rose with another arrow ready. But the remaining soldier had grabbed the cub, using it as a shield. "Drop it, Reeves!" the man shouted. He held the struggling cub with one arm while maintaining aim with his sidearm, a smaller but still lethal energy weapon. "Or I drop this thing right here." The cub struggled in the soldier's grip, its oversized eyes wide with terror. The female made a move forward but froze when the soldier pressed his weapon against the cub's head. The standoff balanced on a knife's edge. Any wrong movement could result in the cub's death. Mark maintained steady aim but couldn't risk a shot with the cub in such close proximity to his target. "Why?" Mark called, keeping his arrow trained on the soldier, but unable to risk a shot. The question was partly tactical, keeping the soldier talking while Mark assessed options, but also driven by genuine need to understand. Why this one? What does Terra Nova want with a child? Orders from the top, the soldier replied, edging toward an escape route. His movement suggested training in hostage situations, maintaining both control of the captive and awareness of tactical positioning. This species has some kind of telepathic ability. Company wants specimens for study, especially the young ones. Trainable, they said. Mark's stomach turned. Weapons he could understand. Cold, practical, profit-driven. But taking sentient children for experimentation? That crossed a line even Terra Nova shouldn't approach. The implications were horrifying. Captive telepaths forced to use their abilities for corporate advantage, perhaps in negotiations or industrial espionage. Or worse, dissection and study to determine the biological basis of telepathic abilities, with potential weapons applications. The cub would face a future as property, not person. "Let the cub go," Mark said, lowering his bow slightly. The gesture was calculated, suggesting potential cooperation while maintaining readiness to attack. "Take me instead. I'm the one they really want." The soldier laughed. "Nice try, but you're both coming in. Drop the bow now, or I see how blue this thing's brains are." He pressed the weapon harder against the cub's head, eliciting a whimper that tore at Mark's heart. A subtle movement behind the soldier caught Mark's eye. The wounded soldier was regaining consciousness, reaching for his fallen weapon. The development created potential advantage if Mark could maintain the hostage-taker's attention. He needed a distraction, something to loosen the soldier's grip on the cub even momentarily. "You know these creatures can mark humans telepathically, right?" Mark called, taking a deliberate step forward. He infused his voice with sincere concern, playing to potential superstitions among frontier security personnel. "Once marked, you're never free. Company men start hearing voices, seeing things. That's why they want to study it." The soldier's eyes darted nervously between Mark and his hostage. "Shut up and drop the weapon." The command lacked the confidence of his earlier statements, suggesting Mark's psychological tactic was working. "I've been marked," Mark continued, taking another step. He tapped his forehead where the elder had applied the blue pigment, implying connection to telepathic influence. "We both have now. You touched it. Felt that tingle? That's the marking. Too late for you." The soldier's grip loosened fractionally as uncertainty crept into his expression. Frontier personnel often develop superstitions about alien species, particularly on isolated assignments where corporate scientific information was limited. Mark's suggestion of contamination played to these fears, creating momentary hesitation. It was enough. The cub twisted suddenly, sinking tiny but sharp teeth into the soldier's hand. The man yelled, instinctively loosening his hold further. The cub didn't break free completely but created enough space for Mark to act. He dropped his bow and launched himself forward as the cub finally wriggled free, tackling the soldier to the ground. They grappled briefly, the soldier's augmented strength nearly overwhelming Mark, despite the element of surprise. A shot rang out. The wounded soldier had managed to fire his weapon. Pain exploded in Mark's side, but adrenaline kept him fighting, delivering a solid blow to his opponent's temple that left the man stunned. The impact against the neural interface of the helmet disrupted the augmentation systems, temporarily neutralizing the advantage of enhanced strength. The wounded soldier was raising his weapon for another shot when an arrow took him in the chest, the female using the bow Mark had dropped. Her shot, while lacking Mark's trained precision, struck with sufficient force to penetrate the weakened section of armor where Mark's earlier arrow had damaged integrity. The soldier collapsed, his weapon discharging harmlessly into the ground. Mark staggered to his feet, pressing a hand against the wound in his side. Blood seeped between his fingers, hot and steady. The energy bolt had cauterized portions of the wound but left others bleeding freely. Internal damage was likely, though impossible to assess without medical equipment. The cub rushed to him, making distressed chirping sounds as it observed his injury. "I'm okay," he assured it, though he knew he wasn't. The combination of wounds, shoulder, thigh, and now side, created cumulative trauma his body couldn't sustain indefinitely without medical intervention. Without treatment, shock and blood loss would eventually overcome even his frontier-hardened constitution. "We need to get everyone to safety." The female approached, gesturing urgently toward the waterfall. Mark nodded, understanding. They needed to reach the hidden cave before more soldiers arrived. The waterfall would mask their heat signatures from scanning equipment, providing temporary concealment from pursuit. The immediate tactical situation had been resolved, but the broader conflict continued. Terra Nova forces would investigate when these soldiers failed to report, potentially sending larger teams to their last known location. The female gathered the other cubs, directing them toward the concealed entrance. Mark followed, each step becoming more difficult as blood loss weakened him. The cub stayed at his side, occasionally supporting him when he stumbled. The small being's strength proved surprising. Despite its size, it could brace Mark's much larger frame when necessary, preventing potentially dangerous falls on the uneven terrain. Behind the curtain of water lay a narrow passage leading into the mountain itself. The female led them deep into the cave system, through twisting tunnels that gradually opened into a larger cavern where the remaining elders and children of the settlement had taken refuge. The space showed signs of preparation. Supplies had been staged, bedding arranged, even rudimentary defenses established at choke points along access tunnels. The settlement had planned for this contingency, creating fallback positions in case their primary location was compromised. Mark collapsed against a wall, his strength finally failing. The cub climbed onto his lap, placing its six-fingered hands on either side of his face, eyes filled with what could only be described as concern. The telepathic contact established immediately, conveying emotions too complex for verbal expression: fear for his well-being, gratitude for his protection, determination to help somehow. The connection provided unexpected comfort, reminding Mark that despite their differences, genuine bonds had formed between them. "It's going to be okay," Mark whispered, though he doubted it. The wound was bad. The bullet had gone clean through, but he was losing too much blood. Without proper medical attention, his chances diminished with each passing minute. The healer's treatment of his shoulder wound had been remarkably effective, but energy weapon damage presented different challenges. The combination of thermal and kinetic trauma created complex injury patterns that even advanced human medicine struggled to address effectively. The female returned with what appeared to be a medicine man or healer, an older male with distinct markings and a pouch of implements. The healer examined Mark's wound, his expression grave. The assessment required no translation. Mark's condition was critical, requiring immediate intervention to prevent fatal outcome. What followed was painful but necessary. The healer cleaned the wound with a stinging liquid before packing it with a paste made from crushed plants. The pain momentarily intensified before fading to a dull throb as some kind of natural anesthetic took effect. The treatment continued with application of pressure bandages and administration of a bitter liquid that Mark was encouraged to drink completely despite its unpleasant taste. The medicine produced immediate effects, reducing pain, clearing mental fog, and seeming to slow the bleeding through some mechanism Mark couldn't identify. Throughout the procedure, the cub remained beside Mark, occasionally making soft sounds that seemed intended to comfort. When the healer finished, the cub curled against Mark's uninjured side, its warmth oddly soothing against the chill that had begun to settle into his extremities. The physical contact appeared therapeutic for both, calming the cub's obvious distress while providing Mark with warmth that helped counter the effects of blood loss. Rest brought some recovery, but Mark knew his wound was serious. The healer's treatment had stopped the bleeding and prevented immediate infection. But without proper medical attention, his chances were slim. If Terra Nova had a field medic among their forces, Mark might survive by surrendering, but that would mean abandoning the cub and its people to their fate. The choice was simple, even if the consequences were dire. Whatever happened, he would see this through alongside the people who had accepted him, despite every reason for suspicion. From his position, Mark could hear the sounds of battle continuing outside, distant but ongoing. Terra Nova was pressing their attack despite the fierce resistance they'd encountered. The conflict had escalated beyond simple asset acquisition to something approaching military operation. The corporation's commitment of resources suggested strategic importance beyond typical extraction site preparation. Something about this planet, or more specifically, its telepathic inhabitants, held value justifying significant operational expenses. The female approached again, this time accompanied by several warriors who had retreated to this final stronghold. One carried Mark's bow, offering it back with what seemed like respect. The gesture acknowledged his contribution to their defense, incorporating him into their warrior structure despite his alien origin. Mark accepted with a nod, understanding the symbolic significance even as he doubted his ability to use the weapon effectively in his current condition. Through gestures and occasional tentative mental contact, they conveyed the situation. The settlement had fallen, but most of the people had escaped to the caves. Terra Nova forces were searching for the hidden entrances. It was only a matter of time before they found this refuge. The corporation had deployed scanning equipment specifically designed to locate the distinctive biological signatures of the blue-skinned beings, making their discovery inevitable despite the natural shielding properties of the mountain rock. Mark struggled to sit up straighter, ignoring the pain. His mind raced through options, seeking some strategy that might save these people from capture or death. "We need to get the children out," he said, pointing deeper into the cave system, then making a circular motion to indicate going around the mountain. "Is there another way out?" The question contained hope born of desperation. Perhaps the cave network extended further than Terra Nova realized, offering an escape route beyond the current search perimeter. The warriors conferred briefly before one nodded, pointing to a narrow passage at the far end of the cavern. Mark understood. There was an escape route, but it would be difficult for the wounded and very young. The passage appeared barely wide enough for an adult to navigate in places, requiring contortions that would challenge even the healthy. For someone with Mark's injuries, traversing such a route might prove impossible. "Then we need to buy time," Mark said, gesturing toward himself and the warriors, then toward the cave entrance. "Hold them off while the others escape." The tactical situation was clear. Sacrifice of few to ensure survival of many, particularly the children who represented the species' future. It was the only logical choice, though implementation would prove costly for those who remained behind. The female protested, particularly when Mark attempted to stand, but he was resolute. Despite his injuries, he could still contribute to the defense, perhaps not through direct combat, but through strategic guidance based on his knowledge of Terra Nova tactics. The cub, sensing his intentions, became agitated, pulling at his clothing to keep him seated. The small being's distress was palpable, communicated both physically and through increasingly urgent telepathic impressions. Mark knelt, bringing himself eye level with the cub. "I have to help," he said softly, placing a hand gently on the cub's head. The fur felt silky beneath his fingers, a tactile connection that reinforced their emotional bond. "Your people saved my life. Now I need to return the favor." The cub's eyes, so alien yet so expressive, held his gaze for a long moment, before the small being stepped back, making a sound that somehow conveyed both understanding and distress. The complexity of emotion in that simple vocalization highlighted the sophisticated consciousness behind those large eyes. Not merely animal intelligence, but self-aware sentience, capable of recognizing necessity while still feeling profound loss. With the help of two warriors, Mark made his way toward the cave entrance. His wound limited his mobility, but he could still use a bow. They positioned themselves in natural choke points, preparing for the inevitable discovery. Mark instructed the warriors on Terra Nova tactical patterns, helping them anticipate enemy movements and prepare appropriate countermeasures. Despite language barriers, the Blue Warriors grasped concepts quickly, adapting human military tactics to their own fighting style with impressive flexibility. They didn't wait long. Voices echoed through the tunnel. Terra Nova soldiers had found the waterfall entrance and were advancing cautiously into the cave system. Their communications indicated deployment of advanced scanning equipment, seeking biological signatures characteristic of the blue-skinned species. The technology would eventually penetrate natural barriers, making discovery inevitable regardless of concealment efforts. The first soldier to round the bend fell to a warrior's spear. The silent attack achieved perfect surprise, eliminating point position without alerting those behind. The second managed to fire a burst that struck the ceiling, sending fragments of rock raining down before an arrow from Mark's bow found his chest. The shot required minimal movement, conserving Mark's dwindling strength while still contributing effectively to the defense. More soldiers pushed forward, using portable shields to block projectiles. The confined space worked both for and against the defenders, limiting the company's ability to use their superior numbers, but also restricting the warrior's mobility. Mark directed fire toward vulnerable points, the lower legs beneath shields, exposed flanks during movement, sensor arrays that guided targeting systems. Each successful hit reduced Terra Nova's combat effectiveness incrementally, creating cumulative advantage despite technological disparity. For nearly an hour, they held the passage, falling back step by step through pre-planned positions. Mark's vision began to blur from pain and blood loss, but he forced himself to continue, knowing every minute they held was another minute for the children and elders to escape. The defensive effort was succeeding. The forced withdrawal remained controlled, exacting maximum cost from Terra Nova for each meter gained. Corporate casualties mounted, creating hesitation among soldiers unaccustomed to significant resistance during standard security operations. A grenade bounced into their position, forcing them to scatter. The explosion sent shrapnel and stone fragments in all directions. Mark felt a sharp pain as something tore through his already wounded side. He collapsed behind a rock formation, blood flowing freely once more. The impact had reopened his wound and likely caused additional internal damage. His vision narrowed, darkness encroaching from the periphery as his body struggled to maintain consciousness despite decreasing blood volume. Two warriors dragged him deeper into the cave as others covered their retreat. They had nearly reached the main cavern when a sustained burst of gunfire cut down the rear guard, leaving their position exposed. The defensive perimeter had collapsed, allowing Terra Nova forces direct access to the refugee cavern. Only minutes remained before the soldiers would overrun their position completely. "Go!" Mark urged the remaining warriors. "Get everyone out! I'll hold them here!" The offer wasn't merely self-sacrifice, but practical necessity. His wounds prevented rapid movement through the escape tunnel, potentially slowing the evacuation enough to endanger everyone. Better to remain behind, creating final delaying action while those capable of survival escaped. The warriors hesitated, but another burst of fire from the advancing soldiers forced their decision. They retreated toward the escape passage, leaving Mark propped against a boulder with his bow and remaining arrows. Their reluctance to abandon him spoke to the acceptance he had earned among them. No longer merely human outsider, but member of their community through shared struggle and sacrifice. The cavern was nearly empty now, most of the refugees having fled through the back passage. Only a few wounded remained, being helped by the last of the able-bodied. The evacuation had proceeded efficiently, prioritizing children and those with critical knowledge or skills. If enough escaped, the species would survive even if the settlement was lost. The thought provided cold comfort as Mark prepared for his final stand. Mark knocked an arrow, his hands slick with blood. The first soldier to enter the cavern fell, struck in the shoulder. The shot lacked Mark's usual precision but still achieved incapacitation, removing one combatant from the engagement. The second took cover and called back to his companions, who began firing blindly into the cavern. The suppressive fire limited Mark's ability to target effectively, forcing him to remain behind cover as Terra Nova methodically advanced their position. Mark ducked behind the boulder, breathing heavily. His vision swam, darkness creeping in at the edges. Each heartbeat sent fresh blood seeping from his wounds, creating expanding pools beneath him. He knew he wouldn't last much longer. Blood loss and trauma would claim him before Terra Nova's weapons could, his body reaching physiological limits despite determination to continue resistance. A soft chirp beside him startled Mark. The cub had returned, its small face determined despite the obvious fear in its eyes. The telepathic bond between them carried complex emotional content, concern for Mark's condition, determination to help, fear of the advancing humans, and something deeper that approximated human concepts of loyalty and love. "No," Mark whispered urgently. "You need to go with the others. It's not safe here." His voice emerged weaker than intended, barely audible above the sounds of approaching soldiers. He attempted to project mental images of the cub following the escape tunnel, finding safety with its remaining family. "Please, go!" The cub ignored him, instead placing its hands on his wound. A strange warmth spread from the point of contact, temporarily dulling the pain. The cub's eyes closed in concentration, its forehead creasing with effort. The small hands trembled slightly, maintaining steady pressure against the injured tissue. Telepathic contact deepened, creating sensation of energy transfer between them. Mark stared in amazement as the bleeding slowed, though the wound remained. The telepathic ability the soldier had mentioned, was it also somehow tied to healing? The cub appeared to be channeling some form of energy that influenced biological processes, accelerating natural healing, or perhaps creating temporary stasis that prevented further deterioration. The effort clearly taxed the small being, whose breathing became labored as the process continued. Before he could consider further, the cub suddenly stiffened, its eyes snapping open in alarm. It pointed toward the entrance just as the sound of multiple footsteps echoed through the passage. Terra Nova reinforcements had arrived, bringing additional firepower to overwhelm final resistance. "Hide," Mark ordered, pushing the cub toward a crevice in the rock wall. "Now!" The command carried desperate urgency, his final attempt to protect the child who had become so unexpectedly important to him. The cub's safety represented his last priority, the final service he could provide to these people who had accepted him, despite every reason for suspicion. The cub reluctantly obeyed, squeezing into the narrow space as Mark readied his bow once more. He had 3 arrows left and doubted he would live to use them all. His hand shook as he knocked the next shaft, weakness from blood loss compromising the steadiness required for accurate archery. He would make these final shots count, targeting officers rather than regular personnel to maximize disruption to Terra Nova command structure. Commander Voss herself led the next wave into the cavern, flanked by 6 heavily armed soldiers. They advanced in formation, weapons sweeping the space systematically. Voss's presence indicated the importance Terra Nova placed on this operation. Committing senior security leadership to field operations suggested strategic priority beyond typical resource acquisition. Her augmentations gleamed in the dim light, representing corporate investment that exceeded annual budgets of some frontier settlements. "Reeves," Voss called. Her voice carried easily across the cavern, confident and commanding. "We know you're here. Surrender now and we'll evacuate you for medical treatment. Otherwise, you die in this hole." Mark remained silent, waiting for them to move into range. When Voss stepped past a stalactite formation, Mark loosed an arrow that grazed the commander's arm. Voss swore and ducked for cover as her men returned fire, forcing Mark down. The brief exchange confirmed Mark's deteriorating condition. The shot should have struck center mass, not merely grazed peripheral target. His strength and coordination were failing rapidly as his body approached critical limits. "That was your last chance, Reeves," Voss shouted. "All units, advance and fire at will." Mark prepared another arrow, knowing it would likely be his last act. As the soldiers moved forward, he caught a glimpse of the cub peering from its hiding place, eyes wide with fear and something else, determination. The emotional projection reached Mark clearly. The small being had made some decision, reaching resolution despite obvious terror. The cub suddenly darted out, racing toward the soldiers with a high-pitched cry that echoed throughout the cavern. The soldiers turned in confusion, weapons tracking the small blue form as it moved with surprising speed across the open space. The unexpected action created momentary tactical advantage. Terra Nova forces dividing attention between Mark and the unexpected moving target. "No!" Mark shouted, rising from cover. Pain exploded through his body as the movement tore at his wounds, but concern for the cub overrode physical limitations. He couldn't allow the child to sacrifice itself, regardless of tactical advantage created. Their bond transcended strategic considerations, generating imperative to protect regardless of personal cost. What happened next defied explanation. The cub stopped directly before the advancing soldiers, raised its small hands and emitted a sound unlike anything Mark had heard before. A piercing, modulated cry that seemed to penetrate directly into the brain. The vocalization contained harmonics beyond normal auditory range, creating physical sensation beyond mere sound. Mark felt pressure against his consciousness, gentle but insistent, while Terra Nova personnel exhibited dramatic adverse reactions. The effect on the soldiers was immediate and dramatic. They clutched at their heads, weapons dropping from nerveless fingers as they staggered in obvious agony. Neural augmentations appeared particularly susceptible, sparking visibly as interface systems overloaded. Voss herself convulsed, her extensive modifications creating catastrophic feedback loop as the cub's emission interacted with her enhanced nervous system. "Mark them all!" the cub cried out in perfect accented English. "Mark them all!" The words hit Mark like a physical blow. The cub had never spoken before, certainly not in any human language. Yet there was no mistaking what he had heard. The vocalization carried perfect syntax and pronunciation, as though the cub had studied human speech extensively rather than merely observed it briefly during their journey together. The implications staggered Mark. The telepathic abilities extended to linguistic analysis and reproduction, suggesting cognitive capacities far beyond what external appearance indicated. As he watched in astonishment, the cub's body began to emit a soft blue glow that intensified rapidly, enveloping the small form in brilliant azure light. The phenomenon generated no heat but produced measurable physical effects. Static electricity crackled across nearby surfaces, small objects levitated briefly, and electromagnetic devices among Terra Nova's equipment malfunctioned spectacularly. The light pulsed once, twice, then expanded outward in a silent wave that washed over the soldiers, and Mark himself. Where it touched the Terra Nova forces, they screamed and collapsed. Where it touched Mark, he felt only warmth and a curious sense of connection, as if something had linked him irrevocably to the cub and its people. The energy recognized him as ally rather than threat, bypassing him while affecting Terra Nova personnel with devastating efficiency. The selectivity suggested conscious control rather than merely unleashed power. The cub somehow directing the effect to spare Mark while incapacitating enemies. The light faded, leaving the cavern in relative darkness once more. The soldiers lay motionless on the ground, their bodies unmarked but utterly still. Only Voss remained partially upright, propped against a rock, her eyes open but unseeing. The extensive augmentations that had made her an effective security commander now sparked uselessly. Neural interfaces permanently compromised by whatever energy the cub had projected. Mark stared at the cub, who stood amid the fallen soldiers, its small body trembling with exertion. As he watched, the glow surrounding the cub flickered and died, and the small being swayed alarmingly. The energy expenditure had clearly depleted its resources beyond sustainable levels, creating potentially life-threatening exhaustion. "Little one," Mark called, forcing his wounded body forward. The movement sent fresh agony through his injuries, but concern for the cub overrode physical limitations. He staggered across the cavern, leaving bloody footprints with each step. The cub turned toward his voice, managing a weak chirp before its legs gave way. Mark lunged, catching the small form before it could hit the ground. The cub felt unnaturally light in his arms, its normally warm body cooling rapidly. The vibrant blue fur had dulled to slate gray, while the distinctive markings on its chest barely glowed rather than displaying their usual luminescence. Whatever the cub had done had drained its life energy to dangerous levels. "What did you do?" Mark whispered, cradling the cub against his chest. His own wounds continued bleeding, but concern for the child superseded. Self-preservation. "What was that?" The cub's eyes, heavy with exhaustion, fixed on Mark's face. One six-fingered hand reached up to touch his cheek, and Mark felt a gentle pressure in his mind. Not intrusive, but comforting. The telepathic connection established despite the cub's weakened state, conveying concepts that transcended language barriers. Images formed, the cub's people long ago, wielding a power they rarely used, a defense mechanism of last resort that required tremendous energy, especially from one so young. The ability had evolved during their species' earlier evolutionary stages, when predators threatened their survival. As civilization developed, they deliberately suppressed this capacity, finding it too destructive and disruptive to their desired peaceful existence. The cub had marked the soldiers' minds, shutting down their neural pathways in a way that would render them unconscious for days. But the effort had nearly drained the cub's life force, particularly because the ability remained undeveloped in one so young. "Why?" Mark asked, tears forming. His voice cracked with emotion he no longer attempted to suppress. "Why risk yourself for me?" More images. Mark protecting the cub, caring for it, fighting for its people. A simple concept, family. The cub had chosen him as parent, forming bond that transcended biological relationship. In the cub's understanding, Mark was not merely temporary caretaker, but permanent family, deserving protection equal to that the cub would provide for biological relatives. The sentiment carried nuance beyond simple affection, recognition of shared values, complementary strengths, and mutual growth potential that defined familial relationships in the cub's culture. Mark felt the cub's body growing heavier in his arms as consciousness faded. The small form that had shown such vitality now lay limp, its breathing shallow and irregular. "No," he whispered fiercely. "Stay with me, please." The plea contained desperation born of genuine attachment. This small being had become important to him beyond rational explanation, creating emotional connection he had never experienced with another human, let alone alien species. The female suddenly appeared beside him, accompanied by several returning warriors. They had heard the cub's cry and rushed back, abandoning their escape to investigate. The female took one look at the situation and barked orders that sent warriors hurrying to collect certain plants from crevices in the cavern walls. Her reaction suggested recognition of the cub's condition. This wasn't unprecedented, merely rare and dangerous. Within minutes, they had prepared a concoction that the female insisted Mark help administer to the cub. The liquid was thick and smelled of earth and something sharper, metallic, almost electric. The cub swallowed reflexively, its small throat working with obvious difficulty. The medicine's components remained mysterious to Mark, but their purpose appeared: restorative, replenishing whatever energy the telepathic display had depleted. For several tense minutes, nothing happened. Then the cub's fur began to regain some of its vibrant blue color, and its breathing deepened and steadied. The immediate danger had passed, but the cub remained deeply unconscious. Recovery would require extended rest and care, according to the female's mental communication. The energy expenditure had nearly proved fatal, particularly in one so young whose abilities remained undeveloped. The female helped Mark to his feet, supporting him as they made their way toward the escape passage. His wounds continued bleeding, creating weakness that would eventually prove fatal without treatment. The warriors collected their wounded and followed, leaving the incapacitated Terra Nova soldiers behind. The corporate forces would eventually recover, but not before the refugees had established significant head start toward safety. The passage led through a complex system of tunnels that eventually emerged on the far side of the mountain, well away from the original settlement and the company forces. There, in a sheltered valley hidden by dense vegetation, the survivors had begun establishing a temporary camp. The location provided natural concealment from aerial observation, while offering access to water and edible plants. Defensive positions had already been established, suggesting organized evacuation rather than panicked flight. Mark's wound was treated again, this time more thoroughly. The blue-skinned healer worked with focused intensity, using plants and minerals unknown to human medicine. The treatment process integrated multiple approaches: physical wound closure, infection prevention, pain management, and systemic support for blood regeneration. By nightfall, Mark could sit up without assistance, though movement remained painful. The cub lay beside him on a bed of soft leaves, its small chest rising and falling in the deep rhythm of healing sleep. The female, who Mark now understood, was not just the cub's aunt, but a respected leader among her people. Explained through gestures and limited mental contact that the cub would recover, but slowly. What it had done was normally performed by multiple adults working in concert, never by a child alone. The telepathic defense represented racial memory rather than trained ability, instinctive protection mechanism activated by extreme threat. The cub had accessed ancestral knowledge without understanding the physical cost, driven by emotional bond rather than tactical calculation. Days passed as the refugees settled into their new location. Mark's strength gradually returned, and the cub began showing signs of waking, twitching paws, occasional soft chirps in its sleep. On the fifth day, its eyes finally opened, immediately seeking Mark. The telepathic connection re-established instantly, conveying recognition and relief that transcended language barriers. "Welcome back," Mark said, softly, reaching out to stroke the soft blue fur. The simple physical contact carried emotional significance for both. Confirmation of continued bond despite the traumas they had experienced separately and together. The cub chirped weakly, managing to lift a paw to grasp Mark's finger. The touch brought a familiar tingle, and Mark felt rather than heard the cub's response, safe now, together. The concept carried nuance beyond simple words, acknowledgement of shared survival, recognition of mutual protection, and commitment to continued relationship despite cultural differences. Yes, Mark agreed, smiling through tears of relief. Together. In the weeks that followed, both Mark and the cub regained their strength. The blue-skinned people began constructing more permanent dwellings, adapting quickly to their new environment. Scouts reported that Terra Nova forces had withdrawn from the mountain, apparently deterred by the loss of an entire squad under mysterious circumstances. The corporation would likely return eventually, but immediate threat had passed, providing opportunity for the community to establish more sustainable defenses. The cub's remarkable act had changed something fundamental among its people. The female leader explained to Mark, through increasingly sophisticated mental communication, that the power the cub had displayed was thought nearly extinct in their species, a defensive ability from ancient times that had faded as they evolved toward peace. Its re-emergence in a child, and triggered by attachment to a human, was unprecedented. The implications were profound. The cub was not merely a child with an unusual ability. It represented a genetic throwback to capabilities their ancestors had possessed when they first arrived on this world. The blue-skinned beings had deliberately suppressed these abilities over generations, finding them too destructive and disruptive to their desired peaceful existence. That they had re-emerged now, in response to human aggression, suggested an evolutionary safeguard encoded in their very DNA. The cub itself, whom Mark now called Terran, after a sound it often made, recovered completely, though it never again displayed the dramatic power it had unleashed in the cavern. It remained by Mark's side constantly, their bond deepening through a mixture of spoken language, mental communication, and the wordless understanding that develops between parent and child. For that was what they had become, family across the boundaries of species and world. Mark taught Terran human concepts and language, while the cub taught him the ways of its people and their profound connection to the planet they called home. Terran's abilities continued developing in less dramatic but equally significant ways. The cub could now communicate telepathically not just with Mark, but with any human who allowed the connection. This talent proved invaluable when a lost Terra Nova survey team stumbled upon their new settlement months later. Instead of the expected hostilities, Terran established mental contact with the surveyors, showing them the truth of what had happened at the original settlement. The shock team leader, a veteran surveyor who had known Mark by reputation, promised to report Terra Nova's atrocities to authorities beyond the corporation's influence. Whether that report would lead to justice remained uncertain. Frontier worlds operated largely beyond effective regulation, and corporations like Terra Nova wielded tremendous power. But the seed had been planted, and Mark dared to hope that someday the blue-skinned people might be recognized and protected under interstellar law. One evening, as they sat together watching the three moons rise over their new settlement, the female leader approached. Through the mental link that had strengthened with practice, she shared a discovery, a communication device salvaged from the abandoned Terra Nova base camp. It could be modified to send a broad-spectrum distress signal that might reach passing ships, perhaps even those not affiliated with the company. "You want to leave," Mark said, understanding her unstated question. The device represented potential return to human civilization, medical treatment for his still healing wounds, reconnection with his own species, perhaps even opportunity to formally report Terra Nova's violations to regulatory authorities. The female's mental response was complex, not encouraging him to go, but acknowledging that he might wish to return to his own kind. Her people would help if that was his desire, recognizing his autonomy despite their hope that he would remain. The choice was entirely his, without pressure or judgment attached to either option. Mark looked down at Terran, who had fallen asleep against his side, one paw resting possessively on his arm. He thought of Earth, distant and increasingly foreign in his memory. He thought of the life he had left behind, solitary, purposeless beyond the next survey mission, devoid of meaningful connection or community. Then he looked around at the settlement, at the dwellings taking shape among the rocks, at the blue-skinned people who had accepted him despite every reason for suspicion, at the new life being forged in harmony with this harsh but beautiful world. Here, against all probability, he had found purpose beyond corporate directives. Here he had discovered capacity for courage, compassion, and commitment he hadn't known he possessed. Here he had formed relationships that transcended species boundaries, creating connections more meaningful than any he had experienced among humans. "No," he said finally, "my home is here now." The decision felt right, not sacrifice but recognition of where he truly belonged. His identity had transformed through his experiences on this world, creating a person fundamentally different from the surveyor who had first observed the valley settlement. That earlier self couldn't return to human civilization any more than a butterfly could become caterpillar again. The female's expression shifted into what Mark had learned was a smile. She placed a hand briefly on his shoulder, a gesture of acceptance, before departing. The touch conveyed approval without possessiveness, acknowledging his choice while respecting the independence that led to it. Mark gazed up at the alien sky, so different from Earth's yet now so familiar. Terra Nova might return someday with greater forces, or other humans might come with similar exploitative intentions. If that day came, he would stand with his adopted people again. The corporation might possess superior technology, but this community had demonstrated resilience and adaptation capabilities that transcended mere weaponry. They would survive one way or another, and Mark would contribute whatever skills and knowledge he possessed to ensure that outcome. But that was a concern for another day. For now, there was peace. For now, there was Terran and the community they had helped save. For now, there was home, not defined by species or planet of origin, but by shared values, mutual protection, and genuine belonging. The cub stirred against him, eyes opening briefly. A sleepy mental touch brushed Mark's consciousness. Happy. The concept contained multi-layered meaning, contentment with present circumstances, joy in their continued companionship, satisfaction with the community's adaptation to new surroundings, hope for future growth and development. "Yes," Mark agreed, gently stroking the blue fur. "Very happy." Terran closed its eyes once more, slipping back into peaceful sleep. Mark remained awake, watching over his chosen family as the moons traced their path across the star-filled sky of their shared world. The experiences of the past weeks had transformed Mark in ways he was only beginning to understand. The corporate surveyor who had once methodically cataloged worlds for exploitation now saw the complex web of life with new eyes. The solitary man who had drifted through existence without deep connections now found himself integral to a community, responsible for a child who looked to him for guidance and protection. Most profoundly, Mark had discovered a capacity for courage he hadn't known he possessed. When faced with the ultimate moral choice, complicity with atrocity or standing against overwhelming power, he had found within himself the strength to choose the more difficult path. That choice had led him here, to this moment of peace under alien stars, with a blue-furred child sleeping trustingly against him. Whatever the future held, Mark knew he would never return to his former life. Terra Nova and the human worlds beyond this planet now seemed distant and somehow less real than the community he had joined. Here, among beings whose language he was still learning and customs he only partially understood, Mark had found something he had never experienced in human society: belonging. As the largest moon reached its zenith, casting silver light across the settlement, Mark made a silent promise to the sleeping cub beside him. He would protect this child and its people with every resource at his disposal. He would help them preserve their way of life while preparing them for the inevitable future, interactions with humanity. Most importantly, he would ensure that Terran grew up understanding both worlds, human and alien, so that someday, perhaps, the cub might help bridge the gulf between these two civilizations. It was a daunting responsibility, but as Mark watched the gentle rise and fall of Terran's chest, he felt equal to the task. One step at a time, one day at a time, they would build a future together. Not the future Terra Nova had envisioned for this world, but something far more precious and worthy of protection. With that thought, Mark finally allowed himself to close his eyes, joining Terran in sleep beneath the watching moons of their shared home. If you like this story, click the hype button. This video deserves to be popular. Have a nice day.